The breath came first, always the breath. Before the eyes opened, before the body moved, there was the breath, slow and visible in the cold air, rising from a pile of animal skins and dried grass on the cave floor, dissolving into the dark. Outside, beyond the rock ledge that served as a door, Europe lay in the grip of a winter that had already lasted longer than anyone in the group could remember. The valley below was pale and silent. The trees were black against a sky the color of ash. Somewhere far off, across the frozen ground, something was moving. But inside the cave, for a few more moments, the fire still held. The group that woke in that cave numbered somewhere between 15 and 20. There were adults and children. There were old ones. And old in this world meant something unforgiving. A body worn down by decades of cold, by close combat with animals 3 times its size, by the constant, unrelenting demand of simply staying alive. The oldest member of the group had a leg that had been broken years before and healed at an angle. The bone had knit back together, not because of luck, but because someone had held him still, fed him, kept him warm while the fracture closed. That kind of care was not a luxury here. It was as essential as the flint tools hanging from the cave wall. The day did not begin with planning. It began with hunger. The body of a Neanderthal burned through calories at a rate far beyond what most living creatures require in that climate, a constant furnace of metabolic heat demanded by the cold, by muscles built like compressed stone, by a brain larger on average than the one carried by any human alive today. Getting enough to eat was not a goal for the day. It was the day. Everything else, the tools, the fire, the movement through the landscape, existed in service of that single animal fact. Fire was the center of everything, not a metaphor, literally the physical center of the cave, around which the group arranged itself to sleep, to eat, to work. The fire had been kept alive through the night by whoever was awake, fed with bone and wood and dried dung when wood was scarce. Letting it die was not an option that anyone seriously considered. Without fire, the temperature inside the cave fell toward the same brutal cold as the valley outside. Without fire, the meat they'd brought in the day before would be eaten raw or frozen solid. Without fire, the adhesive they made from birch bark, boiled down into a black resinous pitch used to bind stone points to wooden shafts, could not be produced. The fire was not warmth. The fire was civilization. The hunters left before full light. They moved in a small group, no more than 4 or 5, bodies low against the wind. They were compact and extraordinarily powerful, short limbs that minimized heat loss, wide chests built for sustained exertion, a musculature that would have made any modern athlete look underprepared. Their spears were not thrown from a distance. They were thrust up close into the flank of a reindeer, a bison, a horse. The risks of this were written on every skeleton in the group: healed ribs, fused vertebrae, old fractures along the collarbone and forearm, injuries consistent with close-range impact with large animals. Hunting here was not a sport. It was a controlled collision. Back at the cave, those who had stayed behind were not idle. The work was different, not lesser. Hides had to be scraped while they were still pliable, before the cold stiffened them into boards. Stone flakes had to be struck from carefully prepared cores, a process that required precise judgment, not brute force. The right angle, the right pressure, the right sequence of blows, and a sharp-edged scraper emerged from the rock. A wrong strike, and the core shattered uselessly. The tools that resulted, scrapers, points, notched blades, were not crude. They were purpose-built instruments refined over generations, passed down not through writing or drawing, but through watching, through hands guided by other hands, through the accumulated knowledge of a group that had no room for wasted effort. The children moved at the edges of all this activity. They watched. That was their education, not formal, not structured, but total. A child who grew up in that cave watched a hide scraped 1,000 times before being asked to scrape one, watched a fire built and maintained before touching the wood herself, watched the hunters prepare their weapons, test their hafting, press their thumbs along the edge of a freshly struck point. The knowledge was absorbed before it was practiced. There were no shortcuts in a world where a wrong lesson, learned once and remembered incorrectly, could kill you before the next winter. By midday, if the hunt had gone well, the group would gather around the butchered animal. The division of the carcass was not random. There was an internal logic to it, a shared understanding of who received what. The organs came first: liver, kidney, heart. Eaten quickly, still warm, because they were rich in nutrients that the cold body craved and that had no way of being preserved. The fat was prized above everything else, not the lean muscle meat that a modern palate might prefer, but the thick white fat packed around the intestines, behind the eyes, inside the long bones. In a glacial winter, fat was not excess. Fat was the difference between surviving the night and not. What they cooked in ways that were more sophisticated than the word primitive would suggest. Roots and tubers dug from frozen ground were placed directly in the embers. Meat was held over flame or rested on heated stones. Some foods were pounded between rocks before eating, not for refinement, but because the body could extract more from food that had already been partially broken down. Evidence of yarrow and groundsel, both bitter plants, has been found trapped in the calcified deposits on Neanderthal teeth. These plants have almost no nutritional value. They are, however, medicinal. Someone in that group was eating plants not for sustenance, but for treatment, and knew the difference. The afternoon brought a different kind of work, maintenance of the social fabric that held the group together. A group of 15 people sharing a single cave through a winter of extended cold is not a romantic arrangement. It is an extremely high-pressure one. There were hierarchies that had to be navigated, tensions that had to be managed, bonds that had to be reinforced. Physical grooming, one individual working through another's hair, served the same function it serves in every primate group. It was proximity, trust, contact, a language of body that preceded any spoken word. Whether the sounds these people made constituted language in the full sense remains a subject of deep argument among those who study them. What is not in argument is that they communicated, they coordinated hunts, they made collective decisions. They transmitted knowledge across generations. That requires something more than grunts. One member of the group had not eaten properly in several days. A deep abscess in the jaw had swollen the left side of his face. Chewing was possible only on the right side, slowly, with soft food. Someone else in the group had stripped leaves from a poplar branch and placed them near him. Poplar bark and leaves contain salicylic acid, the compound that would be isolated centuries and centuries later and turned into aspirin. Whether the connection between the plant and the relief was explicitly understood or simply observed over time does not change what happened. One person in pain was given something that reduced that pain by another person who knew it would. That is the definition of medicine, regardless of the era in which it is practiced. Darkness came fast in a European winter. By the time the light was gone from the valley, the group was back inside, arranged around the fire again. The cave smelled of smoke, of wet animal skin, of cooked fat, of bodies that had spent the day in cold air. Someone was working on a piece of ochre, the red iron oxide pigment that turns up at site after site associated with these people, rubbed across skin, pressed into grooves in stone, mixed with fat and stored in shells. What exactly they were doing with it is not certain. What is certain is that they were doing something deliberate with something that had no practical survival function. They were making a choice about color, about appearance, about how they wished to be seen, or perhaps how they wished to see themselves. Not everyone who went out that day came back undamaged. A young adult had a gash along the forearm from a flint edge that slipped during the butchering. The wound was cleaned, with what exactly remains uncertain, but the low rates of infection found in Neanderthal skeletal remains suggest that wound management was practiced, not left to chance. Ochre, with its antiseptic properties, may have been pressed into the cut. Animal fat may have been applied as a barrier. Whatever the method, the group's survival depended on keeping its members functional. A wound that became septic in that environment, without the tools to manage infection systemically, was a slow death sentence. Not just for the injured person, but for every member of a group that could not afford to lose a single working body. At some point, in the deep middle of the night, one of the children woke and started crying. The high, flat sound of a young body that was cold and frightened, and didn't have the words to explain either condition. Someone picked the child up without comment, pressed the small body against a larger one, pulled a skin over both of them. The fire crackled once, threw a brief orange light across the cave wall, and settled back to a steady burn. The child went quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the valley in long, slow pulses, pressing against the rock face, finding no way in. The dead were remembered here. At sites where these people lived and died, bones have been found placed with deliberate care. A body in a shallow depression, positioned, sometimes accompanied by objects. Whether this was ritual in the way we understand ritual is a question that may never be fully resolved. What it was, without question, was intentional. The body was not left where it fell. It was not discarded. Someone spent time and effort doing something specific with the remains of a person they had known. That is not the behavior of a creature indifferent to loss. That is grief wearing the tools it had available. The fire burned through the night, fed at intervals by whoever was awake. The group slept close, conserving heat the way all animals in a cold world eventually learn to, not from affection, though affection was certainly there, but from the basic physics of shared warmth. One body alone loses heat to the air around it. Several bodies together lose far less. The mathematics of survival have always been simple. What has never been simple is everything that makes survival feel, from the inside, like something more than mere survival. The warmth pressed into an injured arm, the bitter plant placed near a swollen face, the deliberate hand laid on a small, frightened body in the dark. Outside, Europe was frozen and vast and indifferent. Inside the cave, the fire held.